Welcome back, everybody. It's the Digital Portrait Drawing course. My name is Kirk Nelson, and we are now on Lesson 5, where we will start to tackle the front view portrait. So here we are back in Photoshop. I have the same file open that we were working on in the last lesson. I've renamed this one to Portrait Blocking because we are going to start blocking out the shading and the other features within it. This is the same file that we sketched last time using the basic head proportions, and I've simply deleted the initial egg oval shapes and the guide shapes underneath it and left just the shape sketch. Now that is something that's worth noting, that when you're beginning out with portrait drawing, or really detailed drawing of any type, a lot of times you work your way through different layers. So you start out with a light sketch. In this case, we actually started out with a reference egg shape that's bisected with lines, and then we drew sort of a mechanical sketch on top of that. And then on top of that, we're now going to do a roughed out feature type sketch. And then on top of that, we're going to go in and start doing some of the details and full out actual drawing. Now, this may seem like a wasteful process because the first 4 layers or so that you draw end up not even being seen. We end up just trashing those and throwing them out. But really, it's all part of the process of learning how to draw these things. Think of it almost as sculpting the drawing from the graphite that's on the paper, or in this case, the darker pixels that's on the screen. Anyway, the whole idea is to evolve the drawing from a basic reference area into a fully detailed illustration. And really the best way to do that is to do it in stages and sort of bring yourself up through it. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. We also have here our reference file that's open. This, again, is from Stock Free Images. This is file 4767735 called Portrait of a Girl, and it comes to us from SGC Studio. So we thank them for the use of the image to use as a reference file. Okay, so the whole point of having a reference file available to us is that so we can go in and start analyzing the way things look and using what we learn in that to change what we see in our drawing. So as I look at her face, I'm noticing that her face is a little bit thinner than it looks like we have. She's got more of a ball or bulbous type chin. Okay, her nose is a little wider than what we've got sketched out here. I think her ears are a little tighter, and her head has more of a squared off shape. So let's go back over here to our work file. I'm going to reduce the opacity of that shape sketch because that's, again, just a way for us to keep things in relative place. I'm going to add a tighten layer, not tighten, a tighten. And what I mean by that is I'm going to start tightening up this sketch. Grab my brush tool. I'm going to be working with the 2B pencil, and I'm going to reduce the opacity to about 40%. Alright, and then I'm just going to go in and start working through some of the issues that I think I see with this. So I think her chin needs to be a little more bulbous, as in there's a little bit of a ball to it there. And coming up, I see her head is a little more square than what we've got. So I'm going to pull that in, which does mean I'll have to move that ear a little bit. But generally, I'm just going to go through and start tightening up the features like this. I'm not going to record every single brush stroke because that's just going to make this video way too long. You can see what I'm doing. I'm just using my reference file and I'm adjusting my sketch accordingly. Alright, now let's zoom in and start working on some of the eyes. Now, the thing to notice is on her eyes, they're slanted slightly upwards, as most eyes are. They're not exactly horizontal usually. There's a slight slant up, but this inside corner is what touches that horizontal line that we were talking about. And then they do usually either go completely around to touch the other side of the line, or this other tip is above that line. In this case, you can tell that the outside corner of her eye is higher than the inside corner. and it's got a much softer almond shape to it and not quite the football shape that we have here. Now, contrary to popular belief, human faces are not perfectly symmetrical. So you don't want to exactly copy one eye to the other side and just flip it. Same with the ears or sides of the nose or the mouth. That doesn't really work that way. It looks a little bit uncanny because our faces do have some slight variations and they are not perfectly symmetrical. Okay, so now we've got the lines basically tightened up to better match what we see in our reference photo, but still using that shape sketch as a guide to help align everything. But we can go ahead and turn that off now, because the next stage is going to be to add in some shading. So let's add a new layer for shading. Now for shading, what I like to do is grab the 9B pencil, because that's a nice and dark, thick one. I like to increase the size up to about 50, 60 or so. And let's turn that brush preview back on. Because the thing to do with this brush is you want to use the side of it. You want to have it tilted so that you can begin just very lightly going in and using that broad edge of that tip, of that new erodible tip, to add in just the basic blocks of the shading elements like what we see over here in our reference photo. Now, a couple things to take note of while you're going through and doing the shading. Pay attention to where the light source is. You can see in our reference photo the light source is clearly from her right, which is our left. We got a nice highlight on this side of her face, which creates the shadow of her nose coming just to the right of it and below it. And that same light source is casting the shadow underneath her hair that's obscuring most of her face, and the eye socket of her left eye is significantly darker than the eye socket of her right eye. And likewise, you can see the shadow underneath her chin being cast on the neck goes in that same direction, and you've got the little shadow underneath her lower lip, but not going onto the ball of her chin here, which catches yet another highlight. So you want to make sure that you try to capture those as best you can just by the simple shading that we're doing. And it doesn't have to look spectacular right now. You're really just trying to indicate to yourself exactly where that light's coming from, what areas are dark, what areas are lighter, and we're just beginning to indicate form and depth with this at this point. Okay, as you're doing this, you may find you're beginning to get some streaking in the mark making. Now that will clean up a little more as you get your experience and you get more used to using the stylus and the tablet. One technique you can use to help with this, to help fill in some of those gaps and not make it darker, is to set the brush mode to, you can either use darker color or darken. Alright, I'm going to keep this opacity down still really low. Maybe even lower to like 10%. So now as you go in, it's easier to fill in some of those areas without creating darker areas around it. So some of those light spots can start to catch your brush tip, while the darker spots are ignoring it. And this helps to fill in and sort of smooth out some of those areas. Okay, so I think at this point we've got a decent handle on the shading. We seem to have captured the light sources fairly well, and we can tell what's going on where and where the shadows are falling. It would be nice to soften this a little bit because it's a nice soft lighting that we see on her, and that's not clearly reflected here. It looks a little bit sharp. So here's one quick little trick that will help out with that. Go ahead and make a copy of the shading layer and move that copy underneath the original. Set the original back down to about 50%. Same thing with the copy. Pull that down to about 50%, and we're going to run a Gaussian blur on that copy. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur, about 31 pixels, 32 almost. And you can see that creates a really nice soft shaded effect there. So it softens that up quite a bit. And having the top one still over it enhances it even more. So we're getting some really nice lighting and shadowing in this. And again, this really is still pretty much just a sketch. So let's go ahead and add in another layer for the hair sketch, or the hair shading up. Now, at this point, it's really not necessary. It just is going to look a lot better in here if we do have that hair filled in. So I'm going to grab that 9B pencil again, pull that opacity down, and just start giving just a little bit of definition here to the hair. And then just for the fun of it, I gotta add something to those eyes. Those pupils are just way too bright for my taste. We can close out our reference image. And we've got a decent start to a good front portrait. Alright guys, so that's it for lesson 5. We have got a solid start on that front view portrait. We've got a really good sketch. We've worked out the shading of it. It's looking pretty good, but now we need to start getting into the details and rendering the individual elements as a finished level. So, next lesson, we will start with the eyes and how to draw them. We'll look into the mechanics behind it and how to render them well, because they are the anchor element of any portrait. See you then, guys.